Perfect. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm super excited, as usual, to be speaking today, while forever lamenting that we can't all be together in person yet. My name is Stephanie, and like she mentioned, I'm a program manager on the Microsoft Edge Developer Experiences team. And today I'm going to be talking about some very new, exciting web tech. So I'm going to be talking about dual screen devices and how you can start designing and building for these devices today with some new web primitives that have been introduced into the web platform. And so while diving into these primitives, I got really, really excited for all the developers out there about how seamless it is to start integrating this code to progressively enhance a layout for a dual screen device. So now we can't really talk about designing for dual screen devices without first talking about responsive design. And so I want to go back to 2002 for a moment. Because responsive design has been around a lot longer than some people may think. So in 2002, a team at Razorfish in Germany was working on a redesign of the Audi website. The team used JavaScript to identify a user's viewport size and serve one of three sizes dynamically depending on that user's viewport size. And though this isn't probably exactly the same thing as what we call responsive design today, the fundamental idea of a site layout adapting to fit what the user had in front of them is there. And so Jim Kalbeck, one of the project members, talks about building this site in a brief post on his website. He mentions the idea of flexible layouts for the web, already thinking about different screen size possibilities at the time with e-readers and something called Web TV. Now, keep in mind, this is 2002, so this is 5 years before the iPhone, but he was already thinking about new possible devices and how to adapt for them. And then 8 years later, in 2010, 3 years after the iPhone, the concept of responsive design as we know it today was formally defined by Ethan Marcotte in A List Apart. Now, more than ever, we're designing work meant to be viewed along a gradient of different experiences. Responsive web design offers us a way forward, finally allowing us to design for the ebb and flow of things. In rereading his article, I found so much of it still applicable to building and designing for the web today. Ethan formalized this concept of design being fluid, not designing for specific devices. And the dual screen primitives that I'm going to talk about today really embrace that spirit of not designing for a specific device, even though this is an entirely new device class. And if you look at what we can do today with web tech across so many different devices and platforms, it's honestly amazing. You can build a single app that runs on multiple platforms, and it'll respond to different screen sizes, resolutions, orientation. We can even target new and old technology so that the user gets the best experience they can for their device. We're already doing these things for so many different devices today. And so today, I want you to come away from this talk with the idea that dual screen devices are just the next evolution for responsive design, for progressive enhancement. It's not a massive new obstacle. I personally don't want you to fear the hinge or the fold of these devices. I want you to be excited to utilize this web technology and be inspired to start using this code today for devices that are already out there or on the market. And so on the Edge team, we wanted to make sure we could empower developers to do just that and take advantage of dual screen devices and enable them to deliver enhanced experiences. Our web platform team has worked incredibly hard in conjunction with community groups to deliver 2 new web APIs for web layout that were nearly impossible when Microsoft first announced its Surface Duo or when the Samsung Galaxy Fold hit the market. So the team designed, proposed, and implemented a CSS screen spanning media feature and a JavaScript Windows segments enumeration API to make dual screen enhanced layouts possible. So the team wanted these new capabilities to be easy to work with. So when designing these APIs, they focused on simplicity and ergonomics. We want you to spend more time thinking outside the box and coding your dual screen device experience than learning new concepts and figuring out how these new APIs would fit into your existing architecture. So let's dive into these two new features. So the first primitive I'm going to talk about is the CSS screen spanning media feature. So dual screens are just the next step in responsive design. So we view it as another responsive design target. So just as you use media queries in your CSS today to detect and serve styles specific to phones or tablets or desktop screens, you can also use a media query to detect this new class of device. So the screen spanning media query can have two values. One is single fold vertical, and this represents the state of the device when the device hinge is vertical and the two display regions are side by side. So our viewport is split into two columns. And the second one is single fold horizontal, and this represents the state of the device where the fold is horizontal and the two display regions are stacked, splitting the viewports into rows. And so we'll look at a basic example here, and then I'll show a more in-depth one later when I go through some design examples on how to leverage dual screen. So in this example, we're combining our screen spanning media query with another media query, min width. So we're saying if the device is in the single fold vertical state and the viewport has a minimum width of 540 pixels, make the background of the body element yellow. So if we run that code on 3 different devices, the result will be that we get the yellow background only on our dual screen device. Now, some of our customers wanted to be able to snap their content to the fold of the device, which makes sense because on some of these dual screen devices, we do have a physical hinge that actually obscures and can break up some of the content. And then others wanted to avoid that hinge altogether and place that content within the display region boundaries of one of the viewports. So with our current media query solution that I just introduced you to, we can detect if the browser is spanning across two displays on dual screen, but is that actually enough to help me create a layout like the one I have here on the screen? Now we could maybe assume that both screens are equal in size, but the team didn't want devs to have to do that because that won't necessarily scale on new devices. We can't say that both the screens are going to be the same size. So let's take a look at the proposed solution for identifying the different displays and their sizes. So on top of the media query, the team has also introduced a set of predefined environment variables that will help with identifying the geometry of the fold. And when I say geometry, I mean the position and size relative to our client coordinates. So in this illustration, we know the 0 point coordinates, and we know where the 100 viewport widths and viewport height coordinates are. And so we have 4 new variables to help with this. So we have fold top, fold left, fold height, and fold width. And we'll use the calc function in CSS to help determine the size of each display region. So you can see here with the device on the left, from 0 to fold left is how wide the first display region is. Fold width is the hinge, so that's how much gap there is between the two columns, which are the two displays. And then we'll sort of look at how to apply these things in CSS and a more in-depth example of calculating the width of the other display here in a moment. But that's our CSS overview. So let's take a look at the JavaScript API. So this is our second web feature. It's the Windows Segments Enumeration API. And it's one method on the window object called getWindowSegments, and it will return an array of one or more DOM-recs. And DOM-recs is an object that exists in the browser today. It's basically a rectangle. And so today, when you're on a desktop computer and you call the getWindowSegments method, you'll get an array of one object or DOM-rect because you'll have one screen no hinge. On dual screen devices, you'll get two DOM recs, representing the two display regions available when the browser window is spanning across the fold. So something important to mention here is that the value we have stored in the segments constant is an immutable snapshot of the device state at the time the method was called. And that means once you resize the browser window or rotate the device, the window segments previously retrieved are no longer valid, and you'll need to call the method again in either a resize event or an orientation change event. So you can see here when we change the viewport from spanning across two displays to only one, we'll fire the resize event for you. And if you rotate the device, this will fire both the resize and the orientation change event. So you can use these events to call this method again and see what the current state of the browser is and what the display region's geometry is at this point. So one question you might have is, when should I use the CSS API versus the JavaScript API? So in some cases, there's no CSS, which can happen when you're either working with shapes and objects in Canvas 2D or WebGL. So for example, you could be building a game that leverages both screens, or for example, a sketching app. That's when you'll want to use the JavaScript API to get the geometry of the display regions. And then another use case would be creating DOM elements at application runtime and appending them to the DOM, and then inserting some styles inline. In this case, it would probably be styles applicable to dual screen devices. So those are the two new web primitives. And I want to talk about future-proofing these APIs, because like I mentioned, this is just the next evolution in responsive design. And at the moment, we've only got two screens on a device. But what if in the future we have 3 screens or 4 screens, which is entirely possible. In the mid-2000s, there was actually a prototype for a 3-fold device. So it's not impossible to think that these things could become a reality. And the team wanted to build APIs that will scale with these new devices. And so the JavaScript API will scale automatically because the mapping is quite direct. We have this concept of arrays, operations, if statements, and conditionals. And so one thing I do want to mention here, this is still experimental. And so the team is looking at possible changes. So they're looking at a possible rename from get Windows segments to get viewport segments. And so if you're using this code, if you have the feature flag flipped on, or if you're using an origin trial, which I'll go into it here in a minute, we don't want your experience to break. So if you are using this, we'll let you know when that change happens. And then secondly, let's talk about scaling the CSS API, because this one's a little bit trickier than JavaScript. We don't have arrays, and we don't have as much arithmetic operation compared to JavaScript. We do have some CSS conditionals, but not quite like JavaScript. And so the team is thinking that they would just add a new screen topology to the screen spanning media query. But in discussing this with the CSS working group, came up with perhaps something even more scalable. So they're also looking at a possible API rename to make it at media viewport span X and viewport span Y with an integer value. And this integer value is going to give you more flexibility when it comes to those devices in the future that may have more than one fold. So for example, in this instance, viewport span Y with a value of 0 would be the same as single fold vertical. And so the team really believes that this is the more scalable option. And this is actually the option that developers liked better based on feedback that was given to the team. And just as with the JavaScript API, for those who are using this code through an origin trial or have that flag turned on, we'll let you know when that change is coming so you can make adjustments. And so let's look at a couple examples of some enhanced designs on dual screen devices. The first one, I'll go through the code, and then I'll just give a couple other possible examples to give you some ideas. So this first example is a mail application on our dual screen device. And so in the example on the left, we have this layout that's just slightly off. And due to the nature of the fold on this device, you can see that some content is broken up and obscured by the fold. And so the experience on the right is what we're aiming for. So let's take a look at how we can get there with our CSS. So our first media query here is blank, but this is where you just put your rules specific to screens that are wider than a tablet. And then our second media query is for our dual screen tablet. So we're targeting devices that have a minimum width of 799 pixels and are in the vertical fold posture. And so once we dive into the CSS below that, we have our main element that is wrapping our 3 columns of our email app. So those 3 columns are the nav, the inbox, and the email content. And so for our navigation in this email app, let's say we have a design spec that says the desired width of that nav is 60 pixels. And since we're using flex direction row, we're going to use flex spaces here, and that acts like the flex items width. So we're going to set that to 60 pixels. And then for our inbox, we want this to consume the entire width of the first display region that's remaining. So our first screen minus our navigation. So we'd have our CSS calculate our width with the fold left environment variable, subtract 60 pixels. And then on some devices, again, we have that mask or that fold that is covered by that part of the device hardware. So we need to add a margin after that column to account for that. And so here we're going to use margin inline end, and our value is going to be the environment variable fold width. And so that's just going to identify that gap automatically. And then finally, for our email content, we want that to grow to fill the rest of the space in that other display. And normally we would just do flex 1, but to sort of demonstrate how to calculate the width of the second display region using those environment variables, we'll set the width manually here. So we'd have our calc function and we would do 100 viewport widths. And remember that is both of the displays. And then we're going to subtract from that the sum of the fold left variable plus the fold width variable. And so that's how those environment variables can work. And so that's our in-depth example. Another example here is a map application. So we could leverage our dual screen here with having the map on one display and then a list of our results on the other. And then the second one I thought of almost immediately while thinking of ideas for dual screen devices. So I was thinking of recipe websites. I like All Recipes or Bon Appetit, and I always have such a hard time with my having to scroll back up for my ingredients. So I was thinking, how great would it be if I could have my ingredient list on one side and then the actual like recipe walkthrough on the other. So those are the only 3 examples I have time to go through, but I hope that's enough to just get you thinking about how you could enhance some of your projects that you're working on. So let's talk about how you can use these APIs today. So both of these, the JavaScript and the CSS API, are available in Edge on Android behind a feature flag, and soon they'll be available in Chrome and other Chromium-based browsers. So you would go to Edge :flags to access the feature flags. But if you don't want your customers to have to flip on a feature flag and you're wanting to use these APIs in a production environment today, you can use our origin trial system, which an origin trial, so you'll sign up for it and we'll give you a token. And you put that token in the meta tag of your HTML documents header. And this is the runtime flag for this feature that will turn on this feature for your domain and all your subdomains if you choose. There are detailed setup instructions on how to use an origin trial and to get started with them at aka.ms/origin trials. And that'll walk through how to use these features because they are experimental and we want you to use them responsibly until they're in a more stable state. And then for developers who don't have a dual screen device, that's perfectly okay. You can still use the DevTools device emulator that's available in Edge and Chrome. This is available on your Windows or your Mac machine, doesn't matter. And you can emulate a dual screen device and make sure that your UI is looking how it's supposed to on dual screen devices if you've gone ahead and used some of this new code. And so if you go into the emulator tool and you don't see Surface Duo or a dual screen device, you'll have to go into your DevTools settings and enable experimental Surface Duo emulation. And then we do have some developer docs to help you get started with this. So you can go to aka.ms/dual-screen-docs, and that will help you get started. And here's a link to the foldables explainer that has a bit more detail than what I went into today. And that's at aka.ms/foldables-explainer. And I hope you are excited as I am about these new web features. And if there's anything getting in the way of you starting to experiment with dual screen devices, please let us know. You can find us at MSEdgeDev or at Surface Duo Dev on Twitter, or you can always drop me a line. I'm Ciata, or you can reach out to me on email. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. It was actually great to see, especially the examples. It was very good. And I mean, at RVO, we do sometimes have in hand these devices as well, because we do reviews on them. So it was actually good to actually contextualize them differently, also from a developer perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that actually ties back into one of our first questions, which is, have you personally used any dual screen devices? If so, which one?
I have not yet, but I am thinking about perhaps trying to acquire a Surface Duo because I work at Microsoft.
Yep. Makes sense. I'll go quickly because I want to actually ask you all these questions because they're very interesting. Can this same behavior be applied to a PC with window across two displays?
As of right now, no. That media query for the screen spanning, it is dependent on that hinge. So, yeah. And I didn't write the spec or anything, but that hinge is the important part.
Yeah, makes sense. And do you have any numbers, projections of how widespread the use of dual screen devices is going to be in the next year?
Off the top of my head, I don't. But there's a handful of new devices. So there's the Surface Duo, yeah. And then there's a couple different Galaxy Folds. It's new technology, so I know some people are like hesitant to try that first device. But personally, in my opinion, I think once they become more frequent and maybe a bit not as expensive, people might be more inclined to start to pick them up and try them.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the questions was actually, dual screen devices are often very premium and expensive. How can smaller development companies afford to optimize for them? Because the DevTools doesn't really sometimes match the real experience that you will actually have on the device.
Right. I would hope that our DevTools emulator is as accurate as it could be. So if it's not, I would hope you would reach out to us.
Yeah, actually, let's go and try all the kind of resources that you put there so we can actually do our little part as well to kind of help these new devices to be a little bit more widespread. And we know that when they get widespread, the cost tends to go down a little. And it's a process that all the bits of technologies that we have has gone through anyways.
Yep.
And one last question. What new user interactions and gestures are dual screen devices going to introduce? I personally asked this question because I was looking at your examples where you have the map on one side and the list of addresses on the other side. I wonder what kind of new interaction users will start playing with these new screens, and if you guys have considered any of these.
I personally haven't thought about that. That would be a good question for the Surface Duo dev handle, though.
I will try and get in touch with them because I was actually curious. Maybe people will try and swipe it to the right if they want something to plot on the left, or vice versa.
Right.
So yeah, just I'll put it out there.
I want to go research that now, though, because I feel like there has to be something.
That's the perfect thing to do on a Monday night after the whole International Women's Day. Perfect. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for your time, and thank you for such a lovely closure of this event. I personally learned a lot, and again, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And now